When the stagecoach door opened, Caleb Rowan expected a cook. What he got was a ghost from his past and a child who wore his own face. The boy's eyes, storm gray like his own, locked onto him with innocent curiosity, while the woman beside him stood frozen, her secret exposed in a single glance. 3 years ago, Caleb had walked away from one night that changed everything. Now that night had a name, a heartbeat, and a birthmark identical to the one on his own shoulder. Would you walk away from a son you never knew existed? Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The Montana wind carried the smell of coming snow across Caleb Rowan's land, cutting through the valley like a knife through wool. He stood on the porch of his ranch house, one hand resting on the weathered post, watching the road that snaked down from the distant ridge. October 1882 had already proven itself cruel. Early frosts had damaged half his winter feed, 2 hands had quit for warmer territory, and his housekeeper had followed her daughter to California, leaving him alone in a house built for a family he'd never had. The advertisement he'd placed in the Helena newspaper had been simple: cook wanted, remote ranch, winter employment, room and board, must be hardy and reliable. 3 women had responded. One was 67 and couldn't make the journey. Another had accepted a position closer to town. The third, M. Clark, had written in a clear, educated hand that she was available immediately and would arrive on the afternoon stage. Caleb was 34 years old and had learned to expect disappointment. The West had taught him that promises were as fragile as spring ice, and people were even more unreliable. He'd built his ranch through sheer stubbornness, surviving blizzards, droughts, and the kind of loneliness that hollowed out a man's insides. He didn't need conversation. He didn't need companionship. He needed someone who could cook 3 meals a day, keep the house from falling into chaos, and mind their own business through the long winter months. The stagecoach appeared on the ridge just after 2 o'clock, a dark speck against the gray sky that grew larger as it descended. Caleb's foreman, Dutch Henderson, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard and the kind of face that had seen too much weather, emerged from the barn and stood beside him. "That'll be your cook," Dutch said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Should be. You check references?" Letter was well written. References from a boarding house in St. Louis. That's enough. Dutch grunted. "Winter's long. Make sure she can actually cook before the snow locks us in." The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the house, its wheels crunching on the half-frozen ground. The driver, a wiry man named Perkins, whom Caleb knew from previous deliveries, climbed down and opened the passenger door. "Your delivery, Rowan," Perkins called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Caleb descended the porch steps, his boots hitting the ground with measured purpose. He expected a sturdy woman, perhaps plain-faced and practical, someone who understood that ranch life was about survival, not comfort. What he saw instead stopped him cold. The woman who stepped out of the stagecoach was younger than he'd imagined, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet and a traveling dress that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, but her posture was straight, her movements deliberate and controlled. And she was holding a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 3 years old, bundled in a coat too large for his small frame, his face partially hidden against the woman's shoulder. As Caleb approached, the child turned, and the world seemed to tilt beneath Caleb's feet. The boy's eyes were storm gray, the exact shade of Caleb's own. His hair was dark with a stubborn cowlick at the crown, the same cowlick Caleb fought with every morning. And there, just visible above the collar of the child's coat, was the edge of what looked like a birthmark. The same strawberry-shaped birthmark Caleb had carried on his left shoulder since birth. "Mr. Rowan?" The woman's voice was steady, but Caleb could hear the tension beneath it, like a rope pulled too tight. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. His eyes traveled from the boy back to the woman's face, and recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Maribel? St. Louis, 3 years ago. A cattle auction that had run late into the evening, a hotel restaurant where he'd sought a quiet meal, and a woman with auburn hair who'd been dining alone at the next table. They'd struck up a conversation, tentative at first, then flowing as easily as water downhill. She'd been educated, articulate, working as a companion to an elderly widow. He'd been passing through, a rancher with money in his pocket and no reason to stay. One evening had turned into a night. One night had been all they'd had. When he'd left at dawn to catch the train west, he'd felt the pull of regret, but had pushed it aside. He had a ranch to run, a life that didn't include attachments, and she'd never asked him to stay. Now she was here, on his land, with a child who looked exactly like him. Maribel. Her name came out rougher than he'd intended. She flinched slightly, then lifted her chin. Mr. Rowan, I'm here about the position, as we discussed in the correspondence. Mr. Clark. The pieces clicked into place. She'd used her maiden name, or perhaps she'd married and been widowed. The boy... His name is Jonah, she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. He's 3 years old. 3 years old. The math was brutally simple. Caleb felt Dutch's presence behind him, felt the weight of Perkins's curious stare, felt the entire world narrowing down to this moment, this woman, this child. You didn't mention... He stopped, aware that anything he said now would be overheard, would become fodder for gossip that would spread faster than wildfire. I mentioned in my letter that I required accommodation for 2, Maribel said evenly. You responded that the house had sufficient space. She had him there. He'd assumed she meant a sister or perhaps an elderly parent. He'd never imagined this. Jonah squirmed in his mother's arms, and she set him down carefully. The boy immediately grabbed hold of her skirt, peering around the fabric at Caleb with those unsettling gray eyes. His eyes, filled with equal parts curiosity and wariness. Ma'am, Dutch said from behind Caleb, his tone respectful but confused. Welcome to the Triple R Ranch. I'm Dutch Henderson, foreman here. We weren't expecting the little one. I apologize for any inconvenience, Maribel replied, her voice maintaining that same careful composure. If the arrangement is unsuitable, I understand. However, we've traveled a considerable distance, and if Mr. Rowan is willing to honor the agreement for at least tonight, we would be grateful. She was giving him an out, a way to send them back without admitting to anything, without acknowledging the truth that hung between them like smoke and still air. Caleb looked at the boy again. Jonah had released his mother's skirt and was now crouching to examine a rock near his feet, his small hands turning it over with the kind of focused intensity Caleb recognized in himself. The child's profile was achingly familiar, the slope of his nose, the set of his jaw, even the way he tilted his head when concentrating. Dutch, Caleb said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Help the lady with her bags. Get them settled in the guest room, the one with the adjoining chamber. Boss, do it. Dutch hesitated only a moment before moving to comply, grabbing the 2 worn traveling cases from the back of the stagecoach. Perkins handed down a smaller bag and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, his eyes darting between Caleb and Maribel with barely concealed interest. That's everything, Maribel said. Thank you, Mr. Perkins. The driver tipped his hat, climbed back onto the stagecoach, and urged his horses forward. The sound of hooves and wheels gradually faded, leaving an uncomfortable silence in the yard. Jonah had abandoned his rock and was now standing directly in front of Caleb, staring up at him with an expression of solemn assessment that no 3-year-old should have been capable of. You're tall, the boy observed. Despite everything, the shock, the confusion, the anger beginning to simmer beneath his ribs, Caleb felt his mouth twitch. I am. Are you a giant? No, just a man. Jonah, Maribel said softly, extending her hand. Come here, sweetheart. The boy ignored her, continuing his examination of Caleb. Mama says we're going to stay here. Do you have horses? I do. Can I see them? Jonah? Maribel's voice carried more authority this time. We've just arrived. Let's get settled first. The boy's face fell, but he obediently returned to his mother's side. Maribel placed a protective hand on his shoulder, and the gesture struck Caleb with unexpected force. This woman had raised their child, his child, alone for 3 years. She'd endured pregnancy, childbirth, and all the struggles of single motherhood without asking him for anything. The anger he'd felt began to shift into something more complex, more uncomfortable. Inside, he said gruffly. We need to talk. Maribel nodded, her expression unreadable. She took Jonah's hand and followed Caleb up the porch steps and into the house. The interior was exactly what one would expect from a bachelor's dwelling, functional but sparse. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large fireplace at one end and a solid oak table at the other. The furniture was well made but worn, the kind of pieces meant to last decades rather than impress visitors. A hallway led to the bedrooms in the back, and a door to the left opened into the kitchen. Dutch had already deposited the bags in the guest room and made himself scarce, probably to avoid the conversation he knew was coming. Caleb gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. "Sit!" Maribel removed her bonnet and coat, helped Jonah out of his oversized jacket, and settled into one of the chairs with the boy on her lap. Caleb remained standing, his hands flexing at his sides. 3 years, he said. You've known for 3 years and said nothing. I knew for 3 days when you left St. Louis, Maribel replied, her voice quiet but steady. By the time I was certain, you were long gone. I had no way to reach you. You never gave me a surname, Caleb, just a first name and the knowledge that you raised cattle somewhere in Montana Territory. Do you know how many cattlemen there are between here and Canada? He did. Hundreds, maybe thousands. You could have tried. To what end? She met his gaze directly, and he saw no pleading there, no regret. You made it clear that you were passing through. One night, no promises, no obligations. I knew what I was agreeing to. You should have told me you were pregnant. How? I didn't even know until weeks later. Should I have hired a private investigator? Spent money I didn't have to track down a man who'd made it clear he wasn't looking for attachments? Her voice remained level, but color had risen in her cheeks. I made a choice, Caleb. I chose to raise Jonah on my own. I chose not to burden you with a responsibility you never asked for. He's my son. The words felt strange on his tongue, too large and too real. Yes, he is. Jonah had been listening to this exchange with wide eyes, his head swiveling between them like he was watching a tennis match. Now he spoke up, his child's voice cutting through the tension. Are you my papa? The question hung in the air like a gunshot's echo. Caleb stared at the boy, at those gray eyes that mirrored his own, and felt something crack open inside his chest. He stopped, looked at Maribel. We can discuss the details later, she said quietly. Jonah's sweetheart, why don't you go explore the room where our bags are? But stay inside and don't touch anything. The boy seemed reluctant to leave, but Maribel's tone brooked no argument. He slid off her lap and walked down the hallway, his small footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Once he was out of earshot, Maribel spoke again. I didn't come here to trap you or make demands. When I saw your advertisement, I recognized the name, Caleb Rowan, Triple R Ranch. I knew it was you. The position seemed legitimate, and I needed work. The boarding house where I was employed closed 3 months ago. I've been taking whatever jobs I could find, but winter's coming, and I needed stability. Something more than temporary room and board. So you brought our son to my ranch without telling me he existed. I brought him because I had nowhere else to go. For the first time, her composure cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion beneath. I had 2 choices. Accept your offer or risk spending winter in a city with no employment and dwindling savings. I chose to give my son a roof over his head and regular meals. If you want us to leave, we'll leave, but not tonight, not in this weather. Through the window, Caleb could see the sky darkening, the clouds lowering with the promise of the season's first real snow. Sending them back to town now would be reckless, possibly dangerous. The nearest settlement was a 6-hour ride in good weather. You'll stay, he said, at least through winter. The position's yours if you want it. And Jonah? Caleb struggled with the words. He's my son. I'm not going to throw him out into the cold. But you're angry. I'm a lot of things right now. He moved to the window, looking out at his land, the barns, the corrals, the endless stretch of prairie that had been his entire world until 10 minutes ago. I built this place with my own hands. I've lived here alone for 8 years. I never planned on a family, Maribel finished softly. Yes, neither did I, she said. But plans change. Life happens. And now we're both here, trying to figure out what comes next. Caleb turned back to face her. She looked smaller in the chair, diminished by the journey and the confrontation, but there was steel in her spine. She'd survived 3 years as an unmarried mother in a world that showed no mercy to women in her situation. She'd found work, raised their son, and somehow managed to maintain her dignity through all of it. "Can you actually cook?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that she blinked. "Yes, I managed the kitchen at the boarding house for 2 years. I can prepare everything from basic meals to formal dinners. I keep detailed household accounts. I can preserve food, manage supplies, and I don't waste." "Good, because I hired you to cook, and that's what I need. 3 meals a day for me, Dutch, and whatever hands are here. In winter, that's usually 5 or 6 men total. You'll have a budget for supplies, and we'll make a trip to town before the snow locks us in." "And Jonah?" "He'll stay here, with you. This is a working ranch. There are dangers, horses, machinery, weather. You'll need to keep him close and safe." "I always do." A small sound from the hallway made them both turn. Jonah had returned, standing in the doorway with a wooden horse in his hands, a toy Caleb had carved years ago and forgotten about. "I found this," the boy said, holding it up. "Can I play with it?" Caleb felt that strange cracking sensation in his chest again. He'd made that horse during his first winter here, when loneliness and isolation had driven him to fill the empty hours with whittling. He'd carved it thinking that someday, maybe, he'd have a son to give it to. "Yes," he said. "You can keep it." Jonah's face lit up with such pure joy that Caleb had to look away. "What do you say, Jonah?" Maribel prompted. "Thank you." The boy clutched the horse to his chest like treasure. "Why don't you take it back to the room and see what else you can find?" Maribel suggested. "But remember, don't go outside without me." Jonah scampered away, his earlier wariness apparently forgotten. The sound of his footsteps faded, replaced by the creak of the house settling and the whisper of wind against the windows. "He's a good boy," Maribel said. "Well-behaved, curious, bright. He's learning his letters already." "He looks exactly like me." Caleb hadn't meant to say it out loud. "I know. Every time I look at him, I see you." There was no bitterness in her voice, just simple fact. The eyes especially, and that birthmark on his left shoulder. "Yes." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 3 years of separation and secrets pressing down on them. "I need to check on the stock before dark," Caleb said finally. "There's food in the larder. Dutch usually makes himself something simple in the evenings. You and Jonah should eat, get settled. We'll figure out the details tomorrow." "Caleb." She stood, and for the first time he noticed how thin she'd become, how the bones of her wrists showed beneath her sleeves. "I meant what I said. I'm not here to make demands or complicate your life. I need work, and you need a cook. That's all this has to be." "That's all?" He gestured toward the hallway where Jonah's voice could be heard, talking to the wooden horse in the language of imagination. "You brought my son to my doorstep. You think that doesn't complicate everything?" "It complicates everything," she agreed, "but it doesn't have to change the fundamental arrangement. I'll cook, keep house, stay out of your way. And when spring comes, if you want us to leave, we'll go. No obligations, no expectations. Just like St. Louis." The comparison stung because it was accurate. He'd walked away once without looking back. She was giving him permission to do it again. "Get settled," he repeated, unable to form any other response. He grabbed his coat from the peg by the door and headed outside, letting the cold air hit him like a slap. Dutch was in the barn checking on a mare that had shown signs of colic earlier in the day. He looked up when Caleb entered, his expression carefully neutral. "She doing better?" Caleb asked. "Yeah. Whatever it was past. She's eating normal now." Dutch set down the brush he'd been using and leaned against the stall door. "So, that boy. Don't. Boss, everyone on this ranch has eyes. That kid looks like you spit him out whole." Caleb grabbed a pitchfork and began mucking out an empty stall with more force than necessary. "It's complicated." "I expect it is, but running away to the barn isn't going to make it less complicated." "I'm not running. I'm working." "Sure you are." Dutch pulled out his tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette. "How long you known about him?" "About 15 minutes longer than you have." The foreman's eyebrows rose. "She didn't tell you before?" We knew each other briefly, 3 years ago. One night, I left. Didn't know about the boy until today. Dutch lit his cigarette, took a long drag, and exhaled slowly. Well, that's a hell of a thing. That's one way to put it. What are you going to do? Let them stay through winter. She's here to cook. That's the arrangement. And the boy? Caleb drove the pitchfork into the hay with enough force to make Dutch flinch. I don't know, Dutch. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with a 3-year-old child who looks exactly like me and calls another man Papa without even knowing what the word means. He didn't call you Papa. He asked if you were. Same thing. Not even close. Dutch took another drag on his cigarette. Look, Caleb, I've known you 8 years. You're the most stubborn, solitary, hard-headed man I've ever met. You built this ranch from nothing because you couldn't stand the idea of depending on anyone else. But that boy in there? He's yours. Anyone with eyes can see it, and running from it won't change it. I'm not running. Then what do you call hiding in the barn when you've got a woman and child up at the house who need settling in? Caleb had no answer to that. He returned to his work, and Dutch, wisely, let the matter drop. By the time Caleb finished with the horses and checked the fences in the near pasture, full darkness had fallen. Lamplight glowed in the windows of the house, warm and inviting in a way it never had been when he'd lived there alone. He stood in the yard for a long moment, watching shadows move behind the curtains, before finally forcing himself to go inside. The smell hit him first, something savory and rich, completely unlike the bland stews and overcooked meat he'd been subsisting on. He found Maribel in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, while Jonah sat at the small table with a slate, carefully drawing shapes. There's beef stew, Maribel said without turning around, and fresh biscuits. I found flour and lard in the larder, and the stove draws well once you know how to manage it. There's coffee too if you want it. Caleb realized he hadn't eaten since breakfast. Thank you. It's what you hired me for. The words were matter of fact, but they established a boundary. Employer and employee. Nothing more. He washed up at the basin and sat down at the table across from Jonah. The boy had drawn what appeared to be a horse, a crude but recognizable rendering. That's good, Caleb said awkwardly. Jonah beamed. Mama taught me. She says I'm an artist. He draws constantly, Maribel interjected, setting a bowl of stew in front of Caleb. It keeps him occupied on long days. The stew was excellent, rich with vegetables and beef, seasoned with herbs he hadn't known he had. The biscuits were golden and flaky. Caleb ate in silence while Jonah chattered about his drawings, and Maribel moved efficiently around the kitchen, cleaning as she worked. When the meal was finished, Maribel took Jonah to prepare for bed. Caleb sat alone at the table, listening to the sounds of domestic life he'd never experienced. Water running, a child's voice asking questions, a mother's patient answers. It felt both foreign and oddly right, like a missing piece sliding into place even as it disrupted the existing picture. Later, after Jonah had been put to bed, Maribel returned to the kitchen to finish cleaning up. Caleb hadn't moved from the table. He goes down easy? Caleb asked. Usually. He was tired from the journey. She dried her hands on a towel and faced him. We should establish ground rules. Go ahead. I'll handle all cooking and household management. I'll keep accounts and prepare a weekly budget for your approval. Jonah will stay with me during work hours. I won't let him interfere with ranch operations. We'll keep to the guest quarters and stay out of your personal space. Anything else? Yes. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. About Jonah. I won't pressure you to acknowledge him or have a relationship with him. That's your choice. But I also won't let him be hurt by indifference. If you're going to be in his life, you need to be reliable. Children need consistency, not half measures. The word stung, probably because they were fair. I don't know how to be a father. Neither did anyone else the first time. But they learned. Her expression softened slightly. I'm not asking you to know everything, Caleb. I'm just asking you to be honest, with him and with yourself. If you can't be what he needs, that's fine. We'll manage, but don't string him along. Is that what you think I'll do? I think you're a good man who wasn't expecting this and doesn't know how to handle it. I think you're scared, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. She folded the towel with precise movements. I was scared too when I found out I was pregnant. I'm still scared sometimes, but fear doesn't absolve us of responsibility. Caleb thought of Jonah's face when he'd been given the wooden horse, that expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. He thought of those gray eyes, his eyes, looking up at him with trust that hadn't been earned. I don't want to hurt him, he said quietly. Then don't. Be present or be absent, but don't be both. Don't be the person who shows up sometimes and disappears the rest of the time. That's what breaks children. She was right, and they both knew it. Caleb nodded slowly. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. Maribel moved toward the hallway. I'll be up early to start breakfast. What time do the hands usually eat? 5:30. I'll have it ready. She paused at the doorway. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for letting us stay. Before he could respond, she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hall. Caleb sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the lingering warmth of the meal and the unsettling reality of his changed life. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent. Winter was coming, and with it, the long months when there would be nowhere to run, no escape from the truth staring at him with his own face. Caleb rose and walked to the window, watching the snow accumulate on the fence posts and barn roof. Somewhere in this house, his son slept, a child he'd never known existed until today, a boy who carried his blood and his face and deserved better than uncertainty. The night stretched ahead, full of questions without easy answers. But for now, there was only this, a house less empty than it had been this morning, a woman who'd traveled across 2 states with his child, and the slow, relentless fall of snow that would eventually cover everything, mistakes and all. Caleb pressed his hand against the cold glass and wondered if a man could change fast enough to deserve what he'd never known he wanted. Tomorrow would come soon enough. For tonight, all he could do was let the snow fall and try to imagine what morning might bring. The snow that began falling that first night continued through the dawn, transforming the ranch into a landscape of white silence. Caleb woke before first light, as he always did, his body attuned to rhythms established over years of solitary routine. For a moment, lying in the darkness of his room, he could almost believe the previous day had been a dream. Then he heard it, the soft murmur of voices from the kitchen, the clink of pots, the smell of coffee brewing. He dressed quickly and made his way down the hall, pausing at the doorway to the kitchen. Maribel stood at the stove, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing an apron over a simple dress. Jonah sat at the table, still in his nightshirt, swinging his legs and talking to the wooden horse he'd claimed as his own. And then the horse jumped over the mountain, the boy was saying, making the toy gallop across the table surface. And he found a castle with a princess who needed rescuing. Did he rescue her? Maribel asked, cracking eggs into a bowl with practiced efficiency. Of course! Heroes always rescue princesses. That's the rule. Caleb cleared his throat, and both of them turned. Maribel's expression remained neutral, professional. Jonah's face lit up with the kind of unbridled enthusiasm only children possessed. You're awake, the boy announced unnecessarily. Mama made eggs and bacon and something called flapjacks. Do you like flapjacks? I do, Caleb said, moving into the kitchen and pouring himself coffee from the pot on the stove. The brew was strong and hot, exactly how he liked it. You're up early. Mama says ranchers wake up with the chickens, Jonah replied. But you don't have chickens. I looked. We have chickens, Caleb corrected. In the coop behind the barn, Dutch feeds them. Can I see them? After breakfast, Maribel interjected smoothly, and after you get dressed properly. It's cold outside. The boy's face fell slightly, but he accepted the boundary without argument. Caleb noticed the discipline in it, the way Maribel set limits firmly but kindly, the way Jonah responded without whining or protest. 3 years of raising a child alone had clearly taught her how to maintain order without harshness. Dutch arrived moments later, stomping snow from his boots on the porch before entering. He stopped short when he saw the table already set, the plates of food waiting, the coffee steaming. Well, he said, removing his hat, this is different. Different good or different bad? Maribel asked. Good, ma'am. Very good. Dutch took his usual seat, eyeing the flapjacks with appreciation. Been a while since this house smelled like a home. Two more hands came in shortly after. Frank Morales, a quiet Mexican man who'd worked the ranch for 3 seasons, and young Tommy, barely 18 and still learning the trade. Both men exhibited the same surprise as Dutch, followed by careful politeness toward Maribel and curious glances at Jonah. Breakfast was eaten with minimal conversation, the men too focused on food that actually had flavor, that wasn't burned or undercooked or bland. Caleb watched Maribel move through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who knew her craft, refilling coffee, checking the stove, managing multiple tasks simultaneously. This was no desperate woman begging for charity. This was a professional doing her job exceptionally well. "Ma'am," Frank said when he'd finished, "that was the best meal I've had in 6 months. You planning to stay the winter?" "That's the plan," Maribel replied. "Then we're in for a good season." Frank nodded to Caleb. "Boss, you made a fine choice." After the hands had left for their morning work, Caleb lingered at the table while Maribel cleaned up and Jonah returned to his room to dress. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken things. "You didn't have to feed everyone," Caleb said finally. "The agreement was for household cooking, not hands. The hands eat in the house, don't they? That makes them household." She scraped plates into a slop bucket. "Besides, it's hardly more work to cook for 6 than for 3. Economies of scale." "You've thought about this." "I've thought about everything, Caleb. I've had 3 years to think." She set the dishes in the basin and turned to face him. "I know this situation is uncomfortable. I know you didn't ask for it, but I'm here now, and I'm going to earn my keep. That's not charity or obligation, it's employment. The better I do my job, the more likely you are to let us stay through winter, which is all I'm asking for." "And after winter?" "That depends on whether you can stand having us here." She dried her hands on her apron. "I'm not naive enough to think this is easy for you. A stranger shows up with a child claiming to be yours. That would shake anyone. But I'm also not going to apologize for surviving the best way I knew how." Jonah reappeared before Caleb could respond, now dressed in wool pants and a sweater that looked hand-knitted. "Can we see the chickens now?" Maribel looked to Caleb, waiting for his decision. He realized this was another test, another moment where he could choose involvement or distance. "Put on your coat," he said to the boy. "And your hat. It's cold." The delight on Jonah's face was almost painful to witness. Within moments, the child was bundled up, practically vibrating with excitement. Maribel moved to join them, but Caleb shook his head. "Stay here. Keep warm. I'll show him around." She hesitated, maternal instinct clearly warring with the desire to give Caleb space to connect with his son. Finally, she nodded. "Jonah, you listen to Mr. Rowan, do exactly what he says, and stay close." "I will, Mama, I promise." The morning air was sharp and clean, the snow still falling in lazy flakes. Jonah's hand found Caleb's automatically, the small fingers gripping tightly as they navigated the porch steps. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through Caleb, this physical connection to a child he'd only known existed for less than a day. "Is it always this white?" Jonah asked, staring at the transformed landscape with wonder. "In winter, yes. Sometimes more than this. Sometimes the snow gets deeper than you are tall." "Really?" "Really." They made their way to the chicken coop, a sturdy structure Dutch had built 2 years prior. Inside, a dozen hens clucked and fussed, disturbed by the intrusion. Jonah's eyes went wide. "There's so many!" "We need them for eggs and sometimes for meat, though the hens are mostly layers." "What's layers?" "Chickens that lay eggs instead of being raised for eating." Jonah processed this with the seriousness of a scholar. "Do they lay eggs every day?" "Most days. Depends on the season and how old they are." Caleb showed him how to check the nesting boxes, how to reach in carefully to collect the warm eggs. When Jonah held his first egg, cradled in both small hands, his expression was reverent. "It's warm," he whispered. "Just came from the hen." "Can I keep it?" "Your mama needs it for cooking, but you can help collect them every morning if you want, if you're careful and gentle." "I'll be so careful. I promise." Jonah held the egg like it was made of glass until Caleb placed it in the collecting basket. They moved on to the barn where the horses stamped and whinnied in their stalls. Jonah was less certain here. The animals were large and loud, intimidating to someone so small. But when Caleb lifted him up to pet the nose of a gentle mare named Bess, the boy's fear transformed into cautious fascination. "She's soft," Jonah said, running his fingers over the horse's muzzle. "Her name is Bess. She's the calmest horse we have, good for riding fences in summer. Will you teach me to ride?" The question caught Caleb off guard. It implied a future, a continuity that extended beyond the immediate present. "Maybe. When you're older, and if your mama says it's all right." "She will. Mama wants me to learn lots of things." They spent another hour exploring the ranch, the feed barn, the equipment shed, the smokehouse where meat hung curing. Jonah asked endless questions, absorbing information with a hunger that reminded Caleb of himself at that age. The boy was bright, observant, unafraid to admit when he didn't understand something. When they finally returned to the house, both of them stamping snow from their boots, Maribel met them at the door with worry in her eyes that she quickly masked. "Did you behave?" she asked Jonah. "I was perfect," the boy announced. "And I collected eggs, and I petted Bess the horse, and Mr. Rowan said maybe he'll teach me to ride when I'm bigger." Maribel's gaze flicked to Caleb, surprise evident. He shrugged, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said. "Now go wash your hands. You smell like chickens." Jonah scampered off, leaving the adults alone in the entryway. "Thank you," Maribel said quietly, "for spending time with him. He's curious, asked a lot of questions. He always does. I hope it wasn't too much." "It was fine." Caleb hung his coat on the peg. "He's a good boy. You've done well with him." The compliment seemed to catch her off balance. Color rose in her cheeks. "I've done my best. It shows." Over the following days, a rhythm established itself. Maribel proved to be everything she'd claimed: an excellent cook, an efficient household manager, someone who could stretch a dollar without sacrificing quality. She inventoried the entire larder, made lists of what they'd need before winter truly locked them in, and reorganized the kitchen with a systematic precision that bordered on artistry. Jonah, for his part, adapted to ranch life with the resilience of childhood. He learned to stay out of the way during work hours, to occupy himself with drawings and the wooden horse and whatever small tasks Maribel could give him. But every evening, when Caleb came in from the day's work, the boy would appear, hovering near but not intrusive, clearly hoping for attention but afraid to demand it. On the third evening, Caleb made a decision. After dinner, instead of retreating to his room or returning to the barn, he sat down at the table where Jonah was drawing. "What are you making?" he asked. Jonah looked up, surprise and pleasure mingling in his expression. "It's the ranch, see? That's the house, and that's the barn, and those are the chickens." The drawing was crude but recognizable, executed with the intense focus only children could bring to their passions. "That's good," Caleb said. "You've got the proportions mostly right. The barn's a little bigger than that, though." "Will you show me?" Caleb hesitated, then reached for a pencil. "All right, see how the barn roof slopes? It's steeper than you've drawn it, like this." He sketched a few lines, and Jonah watched with rapt attention. From the kitchen, Caleb could feel Maribel's presence, could sense her watching this interaction, but she didn't interrupt. "Can you draw a horse?" Jonah asked. "I can try." Caleb's drawing skills were rudimentary at best, but he managed a passable horse. Jonah was delighted, immediately trying to copy it on his own slate. They spent the next hour like that, drawing, talking about the ranch, about animals and weather, and all the small details that made up daily life. It was easier than Caleb had expected, this business of connecting with a child. Jonah asked questions, yes, but he also listened. He was interested in learning and understanding how things worked. When Maribel finally announced it was time for bed, Jonah groaned but complied. As she led him away, the boy turned back. "Will you draw with me again tomorrow?" Caleb felt that now familiar crack in his chest, that sensation of something hard and protective giving way. "If there's time. I'll be fast with my chores, I promise." After they'd gone, Caleb sat alone at the table, staring at the drawing scattered across its surface. His whole life he'd believed he was meant to be alone, that solitude was his natural state. But sitting here in a house filled with the sounds of other people, looking at crude sketches of horses and barns made by a child who shared his blood, he wondered if he'd been wrong, The next morning brought a problem that required Caleb's immediate attention. One of the fence lines had gone down in the night, and several head of cattle had wandered into the neighboring property. He spent the entire day with Dutch and Frank, repairing the fence and rounding up the strays. By the time he returned to the house, exhausted and covered in mud, dinner was cold and Jonah was already in bed. Maribel reheated his meal without comment, setting it before him with the same efficiency she brought to everything. He waited up as long as he could, she said, kept asking when you'd be back. Guilt twisted in Caleb's gut. Fence emergency. Couldn't be helped. I know, I'm not criticizing. She poured him coffee. But he was disappointed. I'll make it up to him. Will you? The question was gentle but pointed. Or will something else come up tomorrow, and the day after that? Ranch life is unpredictable. I understand that. But Jonah doesn't. He just knows you promised to draw with him, and then you weren't here. I didn't promise. I said if there was time. To a 3-year-old, that's the same thing. Caleb set down his fork, appetite suddenly gone. I don't know how to do this, Maribel. I don't know how to be what he needs while running a ranch. There aren't enough hours in the day. Then you make choices, she said simply. Every parent does. You decide what matters most in any given moment, and you live with the consequences. She sat down across from him, her expression softening. I'm not trying to make this harder than it already is. I'm just telling you what I've learned. Children need consistency. They need to know they can count on you. If you're going to be in his life, you have to be reliable. And if you can't be, it's better to maintain distance than to keep disappointing him. You think I should stay away from him? I think you should decide what you're capable of and be honest about it. Don't make him care about you if you're not prepared to care back. The words stung because they were fair. Caleb had been treating this situation like something temporary, something he could navigate day by day without committing to a larger decision. But Maribel was right. Jonah was already becoming attached, already starting to see Caleb as a figure of importance. And if Caleb couldn't or wouldn't reciprocate, the kindest thing would be to establish clear boundaries now. He thought about that, sitting in the quiet kitchen with a woman who'd once been a stranger and was now something he couldn't quite define. He thought about the boy sleeping down the hall, who shared his face and his blood and deserved better than half measures. I want to try, he said finally. I want to be something to him. I'm just not sure what that looks like yet. Maribel's expression gentled further. Then we figure it out together. But Caleb, you need to understand something. I won't let you hurt him. If you decide you can't handle this, you tell me now, and we'll maintain professional distance. But don't string him along. Don't let him hope for something you can't give. And if I want to give it but don't know how, then you learn. The same way everyone else does, by trying and failing and trying again. She stood, collecting his empty plate. He's resilient. He can handle imperfection. What he can't handle is indifference masked as obligation. That night, Caleb lay awake for hours, thinking about choices and consequences, about the life he'd built in isolation and the family that had appeared on his doorstep. Somewhere in the house, Jonah slept, dreaming whatever children dreamed. And somewhere else, Maribel likely lay awake too, worrying about the future and whether she'd made the right choice in coming here. The snow continued to fall, and Caleb understood that winter would be long enough to make decisions that would shape all their lives. Long enough to either build something real or let it slip away through fear and uncertainty. The following morning, he woke early and made a choice. Before heading out to his work, he stopped by Jonah's room. The boy was still asleep, curled around the wooden horse, his face peaceful in the gray dawn light. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. Then he left quietly and went to find Dutch. I need you to handle the northwest fence inspection today, he told the foreman. Dutch raised an eyebrow. That's usually your job. I know, but I have something else I need to do. This about the boy? Yeah. Dutch nodded slowly. Good. That's good, boss. When Jonah emerged for breakfast, freshly dressed and sleepy-eyed, Caleb was waiting at the table. Good morning, the boy said, surprise evident in his voice. Morning. I thought maybe after you finish eating, you could help me with something. Really? What? The chicken coop needs fresh straw, and Bess needs grooming. Figured you could learn how to do both. The transformation in Jonah's face was remarkable, from sleepy to radiant in an instant. Yes, I want to help. Maribel appeared from the kitchen, coffee pot in hand, and met Caleb's eyes. She didn't say anything, but her slight nod conveyed understanding, perhaps even approval. They spent the morning together, Caleb showing Jonah how to spread straw, how to use a curry comb on a horse's coat, how to check hooves for stones. The boy was clumsy and slow, but eager and attentive. He listened to instructions and tried his best, and when he made mistakes, he accepted correction without complaint. "You're doing good," Caleb said as Jonah carefully combed Bess's mane. "Real good." "Mama says practice makes better." "Not perfect?" "She says perfect isn't real, but better always is." Caleb found himself smiling. "Your mama's a smart woman." "The smartest," Jonah agreed with absolute certainty. Lunch was a simple affair. Sandwiches and soup that Maribel had waiting when they came in, cold and hungry. Jonah chattered through the meal, telling his mother everything they'd done, every small accomplishment. Maribel listened with patient attention, asking questions, praising his efforts. Watching them together, Caleb saw the bond they'd forged through 3 years of depending solely on each other. There was an ease between them, a shorthand of understanding that only came from shared experience and unconditional love. He felt like an outsider looking in on something precious, something he had no real right to. But then Jonah turned to him, those gray eyes, his eyes, shining with happiness, and said, "Can we draw tonight? Like you said?" And Caleb found himself nodding before he'd even thought about it. "Yeah, we can draw." The days that followed established a new pattern. Caleb made time in the mornings to include Jonah in small tasks around the ranch. The boy shadowed him like a small, curious ghost, absorbing information and asking endless questions. In the evenings, they drew together, or Caleb told stories about the ranch, about cattle drives and harsh winters, and the slow, patient work of building something from nothing. Maribel watched these interactions with guarded hope, never pushing, never demanding more than Caleb seemed willing to give. She maintained her professional boundaries during the day, managing the household with quiet competence, but in the evenings, when work was done, she'd sit nearby with her mending or a book, a silent presence that somehow made everything feel more complete. 1 week became 2, and the snow deepened. The ranch settled into winter hibernation, the pace of work slowing as temperatures dropped. There was still plenty to do, animals to tend, equipment to repair, preparations to make, but the frantic urgency of autumn had passed. It was during this slower time that Caleb began to truly understand what he'd been missing. The house no longer felt like a shelter against the cold, but like a home. Meals were shared experiences, conversations rather than silent fuel. Evenings held warmth beyond the fire, laughter, stories, the small domestic moments that knit people together. He caught himself looking forward to the end of each day, to the moment when he could come inside and find Maribel in the kitchen, Jonah at the table. He noticed the way lamplight caught in Maribel's hair, the way her hands moved with graceful efficiency, the rare smile that transformed her serious face into something beautiful. He noticed how Jonah's vocabulary expanded daily, how the boy's drawings grew more detailed and confident, how trust was building between them in small, steady increments. And he began to notice something else, the way Maribel's dresses hung loose on her frame, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many nights with too little sleep, the careful way she portioned food to ensure Jonah and the hands ate their fill while she took less. Late one evening, after Jonah had gone to bed, Caleb found her in the kitchen, reconciling the household accounts by lamplight. She looked exhausted, her shoulders curved with weariness. "You should rest," he said. She looked up, startled. "I'm almost finished. It can wait until morning. I prefer to keep current records." But even as she said it, she rubbed her eyes. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "How long were you unemployed before you came here?" The question clearly caught her off guard. "Why does it matter?" "Because you look like you haven't had a decent meal or a full night's sleep in months. And I'm wondering how bad things were before you answered my advertisement." Maribel set down her pencil carefully. "Bad enough. The boarding house closed in July. I found work as a laundress for a few weeks, but it didn't pay enough for room and board for both of us. After that, I took whatever I could find, mending, cleaning, cooking for private parties. But work was sporadic, and landlords don't accept sporadic payment. Where were you living? A boarding house for working women. It was adequate, until I couldn't afford it anymore. And then she met his eyes, and he saw pride and shame warring in her expression. Then we stayed in cheaper places, places that weren't particular about references or backgrounds, places where you paid by the week and didn't ask questions about the people in the next room. The implication was clear. She'd taken her son into rough neighborhoods, dangerous places, because it was all she could afford. Why didn't you write to me sooner? Caleb asked. If things were that desperate. Because I didn't want your charity, she said sharply. I didn't want to be some woman who appeared 3 years later demanding money for a child you'd never met. I wanted to support my son myself, with my own work. I only came here because it was a legitimate position, something I could do on my own merit. Your pride nearly put you and Jonah on the street. My pride is all I had left. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you know what it's like, Caleb? To be an unmarried mother in a city that considers you immoral? To have people look at your child like he's evidence of your sin? To watch him go hungry because no one will employ a woman with a bastard son? The crude word hung between them, ugly and sharp. He's not, Caleb started. To the world, he is. And so am I, a fallen woman, a cautionary tale. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. But I survived it. I kept him fed and clothed and safe, and I maintained my dignity. So don't you dare judge me for having pride when it's the only thing that kept me going. She tried to move past him, but Caleb caught her wrist gently. I'm not judging you. I'm saying you don't have to struggle anymore. You're here now. You're safe. And you're not alone. Maribel looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. Something shifted in her expression, the defensive anger giving way to a vulnerability that made Caleb's chest ache. For how long? She whispered. How long until you decide this is too complicated, too difficult? How long until winter ends and you send us away? I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I don't want you starving yourself to make sure everyone else eats. I know I don't want you working yourself to exhaustion, trying to prove you deserve to be here. You're not a servant in this house, Maribel. You're... He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. I'm what? You're Jonah's mother, and he's my son. That makes you family, whether we intended it or not. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Family. Yeah. She pulled her wrist free, not angrily but gently. I don't know what to do with that, Caleb. I've been alone for so long. It's hard to believe in anything else. Then don't believe. Just accept it for now. Eat properly. Sleep when you're tired. Let yourself rest. And if you change your mind, then we'll deal with it when it happens. But killing yourself trying to earn your place won't change anything. You've already proven you can do the work. Now prove you can trust that you don't have to do it alone. Maribel stood there for a long moment, processing his words. Finally, she nodded. All right. I'll try. That's all I'm asking. She gathered her papers and left, leaving Caleb alone in the kitchen with his thoughts. He hadn't meant to say so much, to reveal feelings he was still trying to understand himself. But the words had come, unbidden and honest, and now they hung in the air like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. But as he extinguished the lamps and made his way to his own room, passing the door where Jonah slept and the one where Maribel had disappeared, he realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about providing shelter or employment anymore. It wasn't about obligation or responsibility. It was about choosing to build something new from the pieces of their separate pasts. And for the first time in his adult life, Caleb Rowan found himself wanting something beyond survival. He wanted a family. The realization didn't come with fanfare or sudden clarity. It crept in slowly over the following weeks, settling into Caleb's bones like the deepening winter cold. He began to notice the small things, the way Maribel hummed softly while kneading bread, the sound so quiet he had to strain to hear it, the way Jonah's laughter echoed through the house when something delighted him, a sound that had been entirely absent before their arrival, the way the ranch hands lingered a few extra minutes after meals, talking and joking in a way they never had when the house had been nothing but a place to eat and leave. The house was alive now, and Caleb found he couldn't imagine it any other way. December arrived with brutal cold and heavy snowfall that kept them close to the buildings. The cattle had been moved to the winter pastures near the barns, where they could be fed and monitored. The horses were sheltered and blanketed. Most of the outdoor work consisted of breaking ice in water troughs, hauling hay, and ensuring nothing and no one froze. It was during one of these bitter mornings that Caleb made a decision that would change everything. He'd been watching Jonah press his face against the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with the restless energy of a child confined indoors for too long. "He needs a proper space," Caleb said to Dutch as they worked together in the barn, repairing tack. Dutch looked up from the bridle he was oiling. "The boy." "Yeah. He's cramped in that guest room with Maribel. No place to play, to spread out his drawings, to just be a child." "What are you thinking?" Caleb had been thinking about it for days, turning the idea over in his mind like a puzzle piece he wasn't sure would fit. "The room next to mine. It's been storage for years, but it's big. Good light from the south window. If we cleared it out, put in a proper bed, maybe some shelves." "You're making him a bedroom." Dutch's tone carried no judgment, just observation. "He's my son. He should have his own room." "And his mother?" That was the complicated part, the piece Caleb hadn't quite worked out yet. "She can keep the guest room. More privacy that way." Dutch set down the bridle and fixed Caleb with a look that had seen through his excuses for 8 years. "You're building this boy a life here, a permanent life. You understand what that means. It means he's not leaving come spring. It means you're not letting them leave come spring," Dutch corrected. "That's different. That's a choice, not a circumstance." Caleb met his foreman's steady gaze. "I know what it means." "Do you? Because a month ago, you looked like a man who'd been kicked by a horse when that woman stepped off the stage. Now you're talking about building the boy a bedroom. That's a hell of a swing, boss." Things change. People don't. Not that fast. Not unless something was already there, waiting. The observation struck closer to truth than Caleb wanted to admit. Something had been there, buried beneath years of solitude and self-sufficiency. Some capacity for connection he'd convinced himself he didn't possess. Maribel and Jonah hadn't created it. They'd simply uncovered it, like wind erosion revealing bedrock that had always existed beneath the soil. "Help me clear that room," Caleb said, ending the conversation. "We'll start today." They worked through the afternoon, hauling boxes and old furniture out of the storage room and into the barn. Years of accumulated junk, broken tools, spare lumber, crates of documents Caleb had never bothered to sort through. Some of it could be salvaged, some burned, some simply relocated. Maribel found them in the middle of this operation, standing in the doorway with flour on her apron and confusion on her face. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Clearing space," Caleb said, hefting another crate. "This room's been wasted for too long." "Clearing it for what?" He set down the crate and straightened, meeting her eyes. "For Jonah. He needs his own room, a proper one." Maribel's expression went through a series of changes, surprise, uncertainty, something that might have been hope quickly masked. "That's not necessary. We're fine in the guest room." "You're cramped in the guest room, and a growing boy needs space." "Caleb..." She stopped, seeming to struggle with what to say. "You don't have to do this. We agreed this was temporary." "You agreed it was temporary. I'm reconsidering." The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them seemed ready to fully address. Dutch made a discreet exit, muttering something about checking on the horses. "Why?" Maribel asked quietly. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb picked up a rag and wiped dust from his hands, buying himself time to find the right words. "Because he's 3 years old and he's been sharing a room with his mother his entire life. Because he deserves a space that's his. Because..." He stopped, then forced himself to continue. "Because I want him to feel like this is home. For the winter. For as long as you'll stay." Maribel absorbed this, her hands twisting in her apron. "You don't know what you're saying. You've known us less than a month. You can't make decisions about forever based on a few weeks." "Then I'm making a decision about now," Caleb said. "About giving my son a decent room and seeing where things go. That too much to ask?" "It's not about what you're asking. It's about what happens when you change your mind. When this stops being new and starts being difficult." You think I don't know it'll be difficult? Caleb moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. I've spent my entire adult life alone because it was easier than dealing with other people. But easy isn't the same as good, and maybe I'm tired of easy. Or maybe you're caught up in the novelty of having a family and you haven't thought about what it actually means long term. Then educate me. The challenge came out sharper than he'd intended. Tell me what it means. Tell me what I'm signing up for. Maribel's composure cracked, revealing the fear beneath. It means you can't just walk away when things get hard. It means you're responsible for a child who will need you every single day, not just when it's convenient. It means you have to stay, Caleb, even when you want to run, because children don't understand nuance. They don't understand that adults have complicated feelings. They just know whether you're there or you're not. I know that. Do you? Because I've been the one holding him when he cries. I've been the one explaining why we had to leave our home, why we don't have much money, why other children have fathers and he doesn't. I've borne the weight of his questions and his pain, and I won't— Her voice broke. I won't let you add to that. I won't let you become another loss he has to grieve. The raw emotion in her voice hit Caleb like a physical force. He'd been so focused on his own confusion, his own journey toward accepting this unexpected family, that he hadn't fully considered what Maribel had endured alone. I'm not going to hurt him, Caleb said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I'm not going to be one more person who disappoints him. You can't promise that. None of us can control the future. No, but I can control my choices right now. And right now, I'm choosing to give my son a room of his own. I'm choosing to make space for him in my house and my life. That's all I can offer, my choices, one day at a time. Maribel studied his face as if trying to read the truth written there. Finally, she nodded slowly. All right, but Caleb, if you're going to do this, you need to talk to him. Not to me, to him. He needs to hear it from you that this is his home, that he belongs here. Children need that certainty. I'll tell him. When? Tonight, after supper. She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Caleb stood in the half-cleared room, surrounded by the detritus of his solitary past, and wondered if he was making a promise he could keep or setting himself up for the kind of failure Maribel feared. But when evening came and the work was done, when Jonah sat at the table with his slate and his wooden horse, Caleb kept his word. Jonah, he said, sitting down across from the boy, I want to show you something. The child looked up with immediate interest. What is it? Come with me. They walked together down the hallway, Jonah's small hand slipping naturally into Caleb's larger one. Maribel followed at a distance, her presence a quiet witness. When they reached the now empty room, Caleb pushed open the door. This is going to be your room, he said. Jonah stared at the empty space with wide eyes. Mine? Yours. We'll get you a proper bed, some shelves for your things. You can put your drawings on the walls if you want. Make it however you like. Really? The boy's voice held wonder and disbelief in equal measure. Really? Jonah released Caleb's hand and walked into the room, his footsteps echoing on the bare floor. He went to the window and pressed his hands against the glass, looking out at the snow-covered landscape illuminated by moonlight. I can see the barn from here, he said, and the chicken coop. And way out there. Is that the mountains? That's the mountains. It's the best room I've ever seen. Jonah turned, his face radiant with happiness that made Caleb's throat tight. Thank you so much. The boy ran across the room and threw his arms around Caleb's waist, hugging him with all the strength his small body could muster. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple, uncomplicated affection. Then, slowly, he placed his hand on Jonah's head, feeling the silky texture of the child's hair beneath his palm. You're welcome, he managed. From the doorway, Maribel watched with tears in her eyes that she quickly wiped away. When Jonah finally released Caleb and ran to explore every corner of his new space, she approached. That was good, she said softly. What you did just now, that was exactly what he needed. I meant it, about him staying. I know, I can see that you did. She paused, then added, thank you for giving him this. Over the next week, the transformation of the room became a project that consumed Caleb's spare time. He built a bed frame from lumber he'd been saving, sanding the wood smooth so there would be no splinters for small hands. Dutch contributed a mattress that had been in storage, still good but unused. Frank offered to build shelves, and young Tommy donated a small trunk that had belonged to him as a child. Jonah watched every stage of the process with fascination, asking endless questions about measurements and tools and techniques. Caleb found himself explaining things he'd long taken for granted: how to measure twice and cut once, why certain woods were better for certain purposes, the importance of square corners and level surfaces. "Will you teach me to build things?" Jonah asked one afternoon as they worked together, the boy holding nails while Caleb hammered. "When you're older, yeah. When your hands are big enough to hold the tools properly." "How much older?" "Few more years." Jonah considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "That's a long time. It'll go faster than you think. Mama says time goes slow when you're waiting and fast when you're happy." "Your mama's right about a lot of things." The boy beamed at this validation of his mother's wisdom. "She's the smartest person I know, except maybe you. Are you smart?" The question was so earnest that Caleb had to suppress a smile. "I know some things. Your mama knows different things. Between us, we probably know enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to raise you right." The words came out before Caleb had thought them through, but once spoken, they felt true. This wasn't just about providing shelter or fulfilling obligation anymore. This was about raising a child, about being present and engaged and responsible for shaping a young life. When the room was finally finished, they held an informal ceremony of sorts. Maribel brought in bedding she'd sewn from fabric ordered from town, a warm quilt in shades of blue and brown. Dutch delivered a lamp for the bedside table. Frank contributed a rag rug for the floor. Young Tommy produced a small wooden box for treasures. Jonah stood in the center of his new room, turning in slow circles to take it all in. The bed positioned under the window where he could watch the stars. The shelves already filling with his drawings and few possessions. The trunk at the foot of the bed. The lamp casting warm light across everything. "It's perfect," he whispered. "It's the most perfect room in the whole world." That night, when Maribel tucked him into his new bed for the first time, Jonah called out to Caleb before he could leave. "Will you tell me a story?" the boy asked. Caleb hesitated in the doorway. "I'm not much of a storyteller." "Just tell me about the ranch. About when you first came here." So Caleb found himself sitting on the edge of Jonah's bed, with Maribel settling into the chair by the window, and began to talk. He told stories he'd never shared with anyone, about arriving in Montana with nothing but ambition and stubbornness, about the first brutal winter when he'd nearly given up, about slowly building the ranch one fence post and one head of cattle at a time. Jonah listened with rapt attention, asking occasional questions that showed he was actually absorbing the information rather than just hearing words. When sleep finally claimed him, his face was peaceful, one small hand curled around the wooden horse that never left his side. Caleb and Maribel stood together in the doorway, looking at the sleeping child. "He's never had this," Maribel said quietly. "His own space, his own bed. We've always shared rooms, shared everything. I couldn't afford to give him more. He has it now. Because of you." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight from the hallway, her expression was unguarded in a way he'd rarely seen. "I was wrong to be so suspicious of your motives. I can see now that you're trying, really trying. That means everything. I should have tried from the beginning. Should have been there from the start. You didn't know. I didn't give you the chance to know." She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-comfort he was beginning to recognize. "I've spent 3 years being angry at circumstances, at the unfairness of everything. But standing here now, watching him sleep in a room you built for him, I realized that maybe things had to happen this way. Maybe we both needed the time to become the people we are now. And who are we now?" She considered the question carefully. "We're two people trying to do right by a child we both love. That's something, isn't it?" "That's everything." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and uncertainty. Caleb became acutely aware of how close she was standing, of the faint scent of bread and herbs that always clung to her, of the vulnerability in her eyes that she usually kept hidden. Maribel, he started, not knowing what he intended to say, but she stepped back, the moment breaking. It's late. We should both get some rest. Yeah, you're right. They moved apart, retreating to their separate rooms, but something had shifted between them. Some acknowledgement of connection beyond their shared concern for Jonah. Caleb lay awake for hours, thinking about the woman down the hall and the child sleeping peacefully in the room next to his own. The next morning brought a crisis that would test everything they'd been building. Caleb woke to Dutch pounding on his door before dawn, the foreman's voice urgent with concern. Boss, we got problems. The creek's frozen solid, and the cattle in the east pasture can't get to water. Caleb was up and dressed in minutes, his mind already working through solutions. The east pasture was 2 miles from the ranch buildings, accessible only by a rough trail that would be treacherous in the snow. They'd need to haul water or break the ice on the creek, both difficult propositions in weather that had dropped to near zero. In the kitchen, Maribel was already preparing breakfast for the hands, moving with practiced efficiency despite the early hour. Jonah sat at the table, still in his nightshirt, watching his mother with sleepy eyes. We've got a situation, Caleb told her. I'll be gone most of the day, maybe longer. Don't wait supper on me. How bad is it? Bad enough. We'll manage. He grabbed his heavy coat and gloves, then paused, looking at Jonah. Be good for your mama. I will, the boy said. Be careful. The simple words of concern from his son hit Caleb unexpectedly. He nodded and headed out into the bitter cold. The day was exactly as difficult as Caleb had feared. The creek was indeed frozen solid, the ice too thick to break easily. They spent hours hauling water from the ranch well in barrels, loaded onto a sledge, the horses struggling through the deep snow. The cattle, desperate for water, crowded and pushed, making the work dangerous. By mid-afternoon, Frank's horse slipped on ice and threw him, resulting in what looked like a badly sprained wrist. Young Tommy got frostbite on his fingers from working too long without proper gloves, and Dutch, usually unflappable, was showing signs of exhaustion that worried Caleb. We need more men, Dutch said as they rested briefly, breath steaming in the frigid air. This is a 3-day job and we're trying to do it in 1. We don't have more men and we can't leave those cattle without water. I know. I'm just saying it's going to be a long night. It was well past midnight when they finally returned to the ranch, exhausted and half-frozen. Caleb expected the house to be dark, everyone asleep. Instead, lamplight glowed in the windows, and when he pushed open the door, warmth and the smell of hot food enveloped him. Maribel stood at the stove, still dressed, still working despite the late hour. Hot coffee sat ready, along with bowls of stew that had been kept warm. Without a word, she began serving the men, making sure each one had enough to eat and drink before they stumbled off to their bunks. When only Caleb remained, she finally spoke. Jonah wanted to wait up. I had to promise him 3 times that you'd be home safe before he'd sleep. The image of his son worrying for him created a complex knot of emotions in Caleb's chest. Guilt for causing concern, warmth at being cared about, responsibility for the trust being placed in him. I'll check on him, Caleb said. Eat first. You look like you're about to collapse. He was too tired to argue. The stew was rich and hot, exactly what his body needed. Maribel sat across from him, her own exhaustion evident in the shadows under her eyes. You didn't have to stay up, he said. Yes, I did. You were out there risking your life for this ranch. The least I could do was have hot food waiting. The ranch isn't worth dying for. Tell that to the man who spent 16 hours in sub-zero temperatures hauling water to cattle. Her voice held gentle reproach. You push yourself too hard, Caleb. You always have. How would you know what I've always done? Because I've watched you for a month now. I've seen how you work yourself to exhaustion, how you put everyone else's needs before your own, how you carry the weight of this entire operation on your shoulders without asking for help. That's what ranching is. That's what dying young is, she corrected. You have a son now. You have people who depend on you. You can't afford to be reckless with your own life anymore. The words were sharp, but came from a place of genuine concern. Caleb set down his spoon and met her eyes. I was careful out there, as careful as possible given the circumstances. This time. But what about next time? What about when the stakes are higher and the risks are greater? She leaned forward, her intensity palpable. Jonah asked me 13 times if you were going to die. 13 times I had to reassure a 3-year-old that his father would come home. Do you understand what that was like? His father. The word settled over Caleb like a mantle, weighted with meaning. He called me that. He calls you that to me when you're not around. He hasn't worked up the courage to say it to your face yet. Maribel's expression softened. He's waiting for permission, I think. Waiting to know if it's allowed. Caleb pushed back from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered darkness. Somewhere out there, cattle were drinking the water he and his men had hauled, surviving because of their efforts. But in here, a child was sleeping, calling him father in whispers, needing more than just provision. I'll talk to him, Caleb said. Tomorrow. I'll tell him it's all right. Will it be all right, I mean? He turned to face her. I don't know how to be a father, Maribel. I don't have a model for it. My own father died when I was young, and the men who raised me weren't exactly warm and nurturing, but I want to try. For him, for... He stopped, uncertain how to finish. For us? She asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Admitting that this was about more than just Jonah, that his feelings had expanded to include the woman who'd borne his child and survived alone for 3 years, felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing what waited below. Yeah, he said finally. For us. Maribel's breath caught, her eyes widening. But before either of them could say more, a small voice called from down the hallway. Mama? Is that him? Is he home? She rose quickly. Yes, sweetheart. He's home. Go back to sleep. But Jonah appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up in all directions. When he saw Caleb, his face transformed with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. You came back, the boy said. Of course I did. Jonah ran across the room and grabbed Caleb's hand, holding it tightly, as if to assure himself this was real. Mama said you would, but I was scared anyway. Caleb knelt down, bringing himself to the child's eye level. I will always come back, Jonah. Always. That's a promise. Even when it's dangerous, even then. I'll be careful and I'll always find my way home. To me. To you. And your mama. Jonah threw his arms around Caleb's neck, hugging him with desperate strength. Caleb held the boy carefully, feeling the trust and love in that small body, understanding for the first time the full weight of what fatherhood meant. When Maribel finally peeled Jonah away and carried him back to bed, Caleb remained kneeling on the floor, overwhelmed by the evening's revelations. He'd faced blizzards and droughts, market crashes and cattle disease, isolation and hardship, but nothing had prepared him for this. For the vulnerability of loving people who could be hurt, who depended on him not just for provision, but for emotional safety. When Maribel returned, she found him still there. Come on, she said gently. You need rest. He let her help him to his feet, too tired to resist. At his bedroom door, she paused. What you told him about always coming back, you meant it? Every word. Good. She touched his arm briefly, a gesture of connection and comfort. Because we're counting on it now, both of us. Then she was gone, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and a future that suddenly looked nothing like the solitary life he'd planned. He'd built this ranch to prove he needed no one, that independence was strength. But standing in his house now, listening to the soft sounds of the people who'd become his family, Caleb realized he'd been wrong. Real strength wasn't isolation. Real strength was letting people in, accepting their trust, and choosing to stay even when it would be easier to run. Tomorrow he would talk to Jonah, would give the boy permission to call him father openly. Tomorrow he would figure out what he wanted to say to Maribel, how to express feelings that still felt too large and uncertain to put into words. But tonight, he simply went to bed in a house that was finally, truly home. Morning arrived with crystalline brightness, sunlight reflecting off fresh snow in a way that made the world seem newly made. Caleb woke to the smell of bacon frying and the low murmur of voices from the kitchen, sounds that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past weeks. He dressed slowly, his body aching from yesterday's brutal work, and steeled himself for the conversation he'd promised to have with Jonah. The boy was at the table when Caleb entered, carefully spreading jam on a piece of toast with the concentrated focus he brought to every task. Maribel stood at the stove, her movements efficient despite the exhaustion that still shadowed her eyes. She glanced up when Caleb appeared, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of what had been said in the dark hours of the previous night. "Morning," Caleb said, pouring himself coffee. "You're moving slow," Dutch observed from his seat at the table. "That creek work took it out of you. I'll survive. How's Frank's wrist? Swollen, but not broken. He'll be light duty for a week or so." They discussed the day's work while eating, the conversation practical and focused. But Caleb was aware of Jonah watching him with those gray eyes, waiting for something the boy couldn't quite articulate. When the hands had finished and filed out, leaving only the three of them, Caleb made his decision. "Jonah," he said, "come with me for a minute. There's something I want to show you." The boy slid off his chair immediately, eager and trusting. Maribel caught Caleb's eye, a question in her expression. He nodded slightly, and she understood. This was the conversation, the moment he'd promised. Caleb led Jonah out to the barn, where the morning sun slanted through gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The horses nickered softly in their stalls, and the smell of hay and leather filled the space with comfortable familiarity. "You know Bess pretty well now," Caleb said, stopping at the mare's stall. "You've helped groom her, fed her treats. She trusts you." "I'm always gentle," Jonah said proudly. "Just like you taught me." "You are. And that's important because horses can tell when someone cares about them properly." Caleb opened the stall and led Bess out into the center aisle. "I think it's time you learned to ride." Jonah's eyes went wide. "Really? Mama said I had to be bigger." "You're big enough for this. We'll start simple, just sitting in the saddle while I lead her. Nothing fancy, but if you're going to live on a ranch, you need to know how to handle a horse." "If I'm going to live here," the boy's voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "You mean forever?" Caleb knelt down, bringing himself to Jonah's level. This was it, the moment to give the child the certainty Maribel had said he needed. "That's what I want to talk to you about. How would you feel about staying here, not just for winter, but for good?" "You mean this would be my real home, and you'd be my real—" The boy stopped, the word hanging unspoken between them. "Your real father," Caleb finished. "Yes, if that's what you want." Jonah's face went through a series of expressions: joy, disbelief, hope, fear, emotions too complex for such a young child to process smoothly. "But I thought fathers had to be there from the beginning. I thought you couldn't be a father if you didn't know about the baby." The observation was so astute, so painfully aware, that Caleb felt his throat tighten. "Who told you that?" "I heard people talking. At the boarding house. They said children without fathers were different. Less." Jonah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Am I less?" "No." The word came out fierce, almost angry. Caleb gripped the boy's shoulders gently. "Listen to me, Jonah. You are not less than anyone. You're smart and kind and brave, and any man would be honored to call you his son. I'm honored to call you my son. Even though you didn't know about me before? Even though, yes, I wish I'd been there from the start. I wish I'd known your mama was carrying you, that I could have helped and been present. But I can't change the past. All I can do is be here now, and promise to be here every day forward." Jonah studied Caleb's face with an intensity that seemed beyond his years. "Do you promise? Really promise? Because Mama says promises are important and you should never make them if you can't keep them." "Your mama's right, and yes, I really promise. I'm not going anywhere, Jonah. This is your home, and I'm your father, and that's not going to change." The boy's face crumpled, tears spilling over as the weight of finally belonging somewhere hit him all at once. Caleb pulled him close, holding him while he cried. Not sad tears, but the release of 3 years of uncertainty and fear. "I wanted a papa so much," Jonah sobbed against Caleb's shoulder. "All the other boys had papas, and I pretended I didn't care, but I did. I wanted one so much it hurt." "I know. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. But you found us now. That's what matters, right?" "That's what matters." They stayed like that for several minutes, father and son holding each other in a barn filled with morning light and the quiet presence of animals. When Jonah finally pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, his smile was radiant. "Can I call you Papa? Out loud?" "I'd like that very much." "Papa?" Jonah tested the word, his smile growing wider. "Papa, you're my papa. And you're my son." The riding lesson that followed was joyful and awkward in equal measure. Caleb lifted Jonah into the saddle, adjusting the stirrups as short as they would go, which was still too long for the boy's short legs. But Jonah sat straight and proud, gripping the saddle horn with both hands, while Caleb led Bess in slow circles around the barn. "I'm riding!" Jonah called out, his earlier tears forgotten in the excitement of this new experience. "Mama, Mama, come see." Maribel appeared in the barn doorway, and the expression on her face when she saw Jonah in the saddle was worth every difficulty of the past month. Pride and love and relief mixed together, transforming her usual careful composure into something open and beautiful. "Look at you," she said, moving closer. "A real cowboy." "Papa's teaching me. He said I'm big enough now." The casual use of the word Papa made Maribel's eyes glisten with unshed tears. She glanced at Caleb, and he nodded slightly, confirming what she'd already guessed. The conversation had happened. The acceptance had been given. They spent the rest of the morning together, the three of them, taking turns leading Bess while Jonah rode and chattered about everything he could see from his new vantage point. When lunchtime came, they returned to the house with the boy still bubbling over with excitement, eager to tell Dutch and the other hands about his riding lesson. That afternoon, while Jonah napped, exhausted from excitement and fresh air, Caleb found himself alone with Maribel in the kitchen. She was preparing supplies for the week ahead, taking inventory with the methodical precision she brought to everything. He watched her for a moment, noting the way afternoon light caught in her auburn hair, the graceful efficiency of her movements. "Thank you," she said without looking up from her ledger, "for what you did this morning, for giving him that certainty. I should have done it sooner." "You did it when you were ready. That's what matters." She set down her pencil and turned to face him. "He's going to hold you to that promise, you know. Children have long memories for things like this." "I know, I meant every word. I believe you did, but Caleb—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "This changes things between us too. If Jonah stays, I stay. We're a package, and I need to know what that means for you." "What do you want it to mean?" "That's not fair. You can't answer a question with a question." "Can't I?" He moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Because I'm not sure what I'm allowed to want here. You came as an employee. You made it clear that's all this was supposed to be." "That was before," Maribel said softly. "Before you built Jonah a room. Before you promised to be his father. Before you looked at me the way you're looking at me right now." "And how am I looking at you?" "Like you're trying to figure out if I feel the same things you're feeling." The honesty of it took Caleb's breath away. "Do you?" "I don't know." She wrapped her arms around herself, that gesture of self-protection he recognized. "I spent 3 years being angry at you, at circumstances, at everything. I convinced myself that what we had in St. Louis was a mistake, something to be endured and moved past. But being here, watching you with Jonah, seeing the man you are, it's complicated. Life's complicated. That's a platitude, not an answer." "All right. You want honesty?" Caleb took a breath, preparing to step off that cliff he'd been avoiding. "I think about you constantly. I notice things. The way you hum while you cook, the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, the way you tuck Jonah in at night. I look forward to meals because it means sitting across from you. I lie awake wondering what it would be like if you weren't just living here out of necessity, but because you wanted to be here. With me." Maribel's breath caught audibly. "Caleb, I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other, really, but I also know I don't want you to leave come spring. Not just for Jonah's sake, for mine." "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying I want more than an employee. I want a partner, someone who's here because they choose to be, not because they have nowhere else to go. And if I'm not ready for that, if I need time to trust this, to trust you, then we take time." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to step away, and took her hand. Her fingers were smaller than his, work roughened but graceful. I'm not asking you to make a decision today. I'm just telling you how I feel, what I hope for. Maribel looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. I need to know you're serious, that this isn't just loneliness or convenience or some romantic notion about having a ready-made family. It's none of those things. Then what is it? Caleb struggled to articulate feelings he'd never allowed himself to have before. It's waking up and actually wanting to be awake because you're in the house. It's coming in from work and feeling like I'm coming home instead of just returning to a building. It's watching you with Jonah and understanding what I've been missing my whole life. He paused, then added quietly, it's remembering that night in St. Louis and wishing I'd had the courage to ask you to come with me then. You couldn't have known. I knew enough. I knew you were different. I knew that conversation we had was the best one I'd had in years. I knew walking away felt wrong even as I did it. His hand tightened slightly on hers. But I was a coward who'd convinced himself that alone was the same as strong. I'm not that person anymore. Or at least, I'm trying not to be. Maribel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You're making this very difficult. Difficult how? Difficult to maintain my boundaries. Difficult to remember all the reasons I shouldn't trust this. She pulled her hand free but gently, without anger. I need time, Caleb. I need to see that what you're feeling lasts beyond the novelty of it. I need to know that when spring comes and the snow melts and life gets back to normal, you'll still want us here. I will. You don't know that. You can't know that. Then let me prove it. Let me show you over the next months that this is real. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he hoped she'd find. Finally, she nodded. All right, we'll see how it goes. But Caleb, if you change your mind, you tell me. Don't string me along out of some misguided sense of obligation. I'd rather have honest rejection than false hope. Fair enough. Same goes for you. If you decide this isn't what you want, you tell me straight. I will. They stood there in the kitchen, the winter afternoon light fading outside, having negotiated the terms of a relationship neither of them quite knew how to define yet. It wasn't a declaration of love or a proposal of marriage, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of possibility. The sound of Jonah stirring in his room broke the moment. Maribel moved away to check on him, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and a sense of cautious hope that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Over the following weeks, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The brutal cold persisted, keeping everyone close to the buildings and focused on essential tasks. But within the house, something was growing, a sense of family that went beyond mere cohabitation. Caleb made good on his promise to teach Jonah to ride, spending an hour each afternoon in the barn with the boy. Jonah's confidence grew with each session, his fear transforming into competence. Caleb found unexpected joy in these lessons, in watching his son master new skills and face challenges with determination. Maribel, for her part, continued to manage the household with impressive efficiency. But Caleb noticed changes in her too. She smiled more readily, laughed at the hands' jokes during meals, allowed herself moments of rest instead of working constantly. She began to look healthier, the hollow shadows under her eyes fading, her too thin frame filling out with regular, adequate meals. And in the evenings, after Jonah was asleep, Caleb and Maribel fell into a habit of sitting together by the fire. Sometimes they talked about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Other times they simply sat in companionable silence, reading or working on small tasks. These quiet hours became precious to Caleb, moments when he could simply be present with someone who understood him. Christmas approached, though the holiday had never meant much to Caleb in his years alone. But Jonah's excitement was infectious, and Maribel's gentle traditions began to transform the house. She taught Jonah to string popcorn and cranberries for garlands, filled the house with the smell of baking gingerbread, brought in pine boughs to decorate the mantel. "We should get a tree," Jonah announced one evening at dinner. "A real Christmas tree. Trees are for fancy city folk," Dutch said, but his tone was gentle. "Ranch folks make do with what we have." "But Papa could cut one down, couldn't you, Papa?" Jonah turned those pleading gray eyes on Caleb. "There's lots of trees on the property. We could get a small one, just for my room." Caleb found himself unable to resist. "All right, tomorrow if the weather holds, we'll find a tree." Jonah's whoop of delight made every man at the table smile. The next day dawned clear and relatively mild, only slightly below freezing instead of the bitter temperatures they'd been enduring. Caleb bundled Jonah up in layers of wool, and they set out on foot, heading toward a stand of pine trees about a mile from the house. Maribel had offered to come, but Caleb had encouraged her to stay warm, to enjoy a rare morning without responsibilities. The walk through the snow was slow going, Jonah's short legs struggling with the depth. Eventually, Caleb simply picked the boy up and carried him on his shoulders, something that delighted Jonah to no end. "I can see everything from up here," the boy exclaimed. "Look, Papa, there's a bird, and way over there, is that the mountains?" "That's them." "They're so big. Will we ever go there?" "Someday, when you're older, there's good hunting in those mountains, elk and deer." "Will you teach me to hunt?" "If you want to learn." "I want to learn everything you know." The simple statement touched something deep in Caleb's chest. This child who'd entered his life less than 2 months ago had become central to it, had given him a purpose beyond mere survival. Teaching Jonah, watching him grow, preparing him for life, these were responsibilities Caleb had never imagined wanting. But now, carrying his son through the snow in search of a Christmas tree, he couldn't imagine his life any other way. They found a perfect pine about 6 feet tall, well-shaped and full. Caleb set Jonah down and took out the small axe he'd brought. "Stand back, way back. Falling trees are dangerous." Jonah obeyed, watching with fascination as Caleb chopped. The work was harder than expected. The tree had deep roots and the ground was frozen. But eventually it fell, and together they dragged it back toward the house, Jonah chattering the entire way about how Mama would love it, how they decorated, how it was the best tree in the whole territory. When they arrived home, cold and tired but triumphant, Maribel met them at the door with hot chocolate and a smile that made Caleb's heart skip. "Look what we found," Jonah announced proudly. "Isn't it perfect?" "It's beautiful," Maribel agreed. "Where should we put it?" "In the main room," Caleb said, "where everyone can enjoy it." They spent the afternoon setting up the tree, decorating it with the garlands Maribel and Jonah had made, and paper ornaments the boy crafted with intense concentration. Dutch contributed a tin star he'd been saving, and Frank produced a string of bells. By evening, the tree stood in the corner of the main room, festive and warm in the lamplight. Jonah stood in front of it, his face glowing with happiness. "It's the best Christmas ever, and it hasn't even happened yet." That night, after Jonah was asleep, Caleb found Maribel standing by the tree, touching the ornaments gently. "You've given him something I never could," she said quietly. "This sense of belonging, of having a real home. We've given him that, both of us." She turned to face him. "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting a partner, not just an employee." Caleb's heart rate picked up. And I think," she paused, gathering courage, "I think I want that too. Not immediately. I still need time, but I can see it now, the possibility of it. Of us being more than just 2 people co-parenting a child." "That's enough for now," Caleb said, moving closer. "We don't have to rush. But I want you to know I'm trying to trust this, to trust you." "I know, and I'm trying to be worthy of that trust." Maribel reached out and straightened his collar, a small, intimate gesture that felt monumental in its simplicity. "You're doing better than you think, Caleb Rowan." On Christmas morning, Jonah woke the entire house before dawn, his excitement irrepressible. Caleb had carved a small horse for him, painted with Dutch's help. Maribel had sewn a warm coat that actually fit properly. The hands contributed small gifts, a pocket knife from Frank, a book of animal drawings from young Tommy, a leather belt from Dutch. But the biggest surprise came from Maribel. She presented Caleb with a package wrapped in brown paper, her expression nervous. Inside was a photograph in a simple frame. She and Jonah sat together, the boy on her lap, both of them looking at the camera with serious expressions. It must have been taken before they'd come to the ranch, during their time in St. Louis. "I thought you should have it," Maribel said, "so you'd have a reminder of where we came from, of what brought us here." Caleb stared at the photograph, at the woman who'd carried his child alone, at the boy who'd survived without a father for 3 years. They looked tired in the image, worn down by circumstances, but there was dignity in their bearing, strength in the set of their shoulders. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough. "I'll treasure this." The day passed in a blur of good food and easy companionship. Even the hands seemed affected by the holiday spirit, joking and laughing in ways they usually reserved for Saturday nights in town. Maribel outdid herself with the meal: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the root cellar prepared with herbs and butter, and a dried apple pie that disappeared almost before it hit the table. In the evening, with Jonah finally worn out and sleeping, Caleb stood on the porch smoking a rare cigar Dutch had given him, looking out at his snow-covered land. Maribel joined him, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. "Quite a day," she said. "Best Christmas I've had in 20 years, maybe ever." Jonah will remember this forever, his first real Christmas with his father. I hope he has many more to remember. They stood in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Maribel spoke again. "I've made a decision," she said. "About us. About this." Caleb's entire body tensed. "Yeah? I want to try, really try. Not just coexist or co-parent, but build something together. A real partnership, a real family." She turned to face him. "I'm still scared. I'm still worried you'll realize this isn't what you want, but I'm more scared of letting fear keep me from something that could be good." Caleb felt something in his chest expand, filling spaces he hadn't known were empty. "You're sure?" "As sure as anyone can be about the future, which is to say, not entirely, but willing to risk it anyway." He reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then we'll risk it together." "Together," she agreed. They stood like that for a long while, two people who'd found each other through chance and circumstance, holding hands on a Christmas night in Montana, building something neither of them had planned but both of them needed. Inside the house, their son slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he had a home and a family. And for the first time in his adult life, Caleb Rowan felt truly, completely at peace. The winter stretched ahead, long and cold and full of challenges yet to come. But they would face it together, father, mother, and child, building a life one day at a time, proving that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never saw coming. The days following Christmas carried a different quality, as if the declaration made on that porch had altered the very atmosphere of the ranch. Caleb noticed it in small ways. The way Maribel's hand would brush his when passing dishes at meals, the way she lingered in doorways when they talked, the way her careful reserve had begun to crack, revealing the woman underneath who'd survived 3 years alone and was finally allowing herself to hope. January brought the deepest cold of winter, temperatures that made even the short walk from house to barn feel dangerous. The hands stayed close, venturing out only for essential tasks, and the house became a refuge against the brutal elements. Inside, life took on an intimate quality born of proximity and shared purpose. One evening in mid-January, after Jonah had been put to bed, Caleb found himself working at the kitchen table, reviewing the ranch accounts by lamplight. The numbers told a story he'd been anticipating but hadn't wanted to face. Feed costs were higher than expected. The loss of several head of cattle to the early freeze had impacted his reserves, and repairs needed in spring would strain his budget considerably. Maribel appeared with 2 cups of coffee, setting one beside him before settling into the chair across. "You look troubled." "Just numbers, nothing we can't manage." "Can I see?" She reached for the ledger, and after a moment's hesitation, he pushed it toward her. Her eyes scanned the columns with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood bookkeeping. "You're running too thin on operating capital." "I know. But we'll make it through to spring. We always do." "You need to sell some stock before calving season. Get cash in hand." "In this weather, nobody's buying cattle in January." "Then sell something else. Equipment you're not using. That old wagon in the barn that's been sitting for years." She tapped the ledger. "You're land rich and cash poor, Caleb. That's dangerous going into spring." Her acumen surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have. She'd managed household budgets on pennies for 3 years. She understood scarcity better than most. "You sound like you've done this before," he said. I managed the boarding house books for 2 years. The owner trusted me because I could stretch a dollar farther than anyone else. She met his eyes. Let me help. With this, I mean, not just cooking and cleaning, but the actual business of running this ranch. I have skills you could use. The offer touched something deep in Caleb's chest. This wasn't just about household management anymore. She was asking to be a true partner in every sense. All right, he said, show me what you see. They spent the next 2 hours going over the accounts together, Maribel pointing out inefficiencies and suggesting solutions Caleb hadn't considered. She had a mind for details he sometimes missed, could see patterns in spending that revealed waste. By the time they finished, they'd developed a plan that would tighten the budget without sacrificing essential operations. You're good at this, Caleb said, genuinely impressed. I had to be. When you're 1 month's rent away from the street, you learn to make every penny count. She closed the ledger with a soft thud. This ranch is sound, Caleb. You've built something solid. You just need to manage it more carefully. He corrected. We need to manage it more carefully. If you're going to help, it's not my ranch anymore. It's ours. The word hung between them, weighted with implications. Maribel's breath caught slightly. Ours. Yeah, if you're willing. I'm willing. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. I'm more than willing. The moment stretched, charged with possibility. Caleb found himself leaning forward, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, and Maribel met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a statement. Her lips were soft and warm, tasting faintly of the coffee they'd been drinking. When they pulled apart, Maribel's eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed. That was long overdue, Caleb finished. I was going to say unexpected, but your version works too. She touched her lips with her fingertips, as if confirming what had just happened was real. We should probably talk about this. What's there to talk about? Everything. What this means, where we're going, what we want. She stood, agitation making her restless. I can't just fall into this, Caleb. I have Jonah to think about. If we do this wrong, if we hurt him, we won't hurt him. We're both committed to that. But we could hurt each other, and that would hurt him by extension. She wrapped her arms around herself. I need to know this is real. That you're not just caught up in the idea of having a family, that you actually want me specifically, not just the convenient package of mother and child. Caleb rose and crossed to her, gently taking her shoulders. You think I kissed you out of convenience? I think you're lonely, and I'm here, and it's easy to confuse proximity with real feeling. You're right that I was lonely. For years, decades even. I'd convinced myself it was my natural state, that I preferred solitude. He lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. But, Maribel, what I feel for you isn't about filling emptiness. It's about recognizing someone who fits, who challenges me and compliments me and makes me want to be better than I am. That's a pretty speech. It's the truth, and I'll prove it to you every day if I have to, until you believe it. Maribel's eyes searched his face, looking for doubt or deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she leaned into his touch. I'm scared. So am I. But you're willing to try anyway? I'm willing to do more than try. I'm willing to commit, to build something lasting. He paused, then added quietly, I'm willing to marry you, if you'll have me. The words came out before he'd fully planned them, but once spoken, they felt absolutely right. Maribel's eyes widened, her mouth opening in shock. You can't mean that. We've only been... I mean it. I know it's fast by conventional standards, but nothing about our situation has been conventional. You're already Jonah's mother and my partner in running this house. Why not make it official? Because marriage is forever, Caleb. Or it should be. And you can't know after 2 months that you want forever with someone. Can't I? He pulled her closer until they were nearly touching. I knew after one night in St. Louis that you were different. I knew walking away from you was a mistake, even as I did it. I've spent 3 years unconsciously comparing every woman I met to a memory of you, and none of them measured up. Now you're here, in my house, in my life, and I'll be damned if I let you slip away again. Maribel's breath hitched, tears forming in her eyes. That's not fair. You can't say things like that and expect me to think clearly. I don't want you to think clearly. I want you to feel what I'm feeling and tell me I'm not alone in this. You're not alone. The admission came out whispered, almost broken. I feel it too, and it terrifies me. Then be terrified with me, but don't run from it. She laughed, the sound caught between joy and tears. I don't have anywhere to run to. You've made sure of that. Building Jonah a room, giving him a home, making yourself indispensable to both of us. Good. That was the plan. Some plan. Trap a woman and her child with kindness and stability. Is it working? Yes, damn you, it's working perfectly. She rose on her toes and kissed him again, this time with less hesitation, more certainty. When they broke apart, she was smiling despite the tears on her cheeks. Ask me again in spring, when the snow melts and the world opens up again. If you still want to marry me then, when you have options and freedom, I'll say yes. It wasn't the immediate acceptance Caleb had hoped for, but it was more than he'd had any right to expect. Spring it is. And until then, we keep building this, together. The following weeks tested that commitment in ways neither of them anticipated. February brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days, snow piling so high it buried the lower fence rails and trapped them all inside. Cabin fever set in by the second day, Jonah growing restless and whiny, the hands arguing over card games, everyone getting on everyone else's nerves. It was Maribel who saved them all from madness. She organized activities to keep Jonah occupied, mediated disputes between the hands with the diplomacy of a seasoned negotiator, and somehow managed to keep cooking interesting meals despite being limited to whatever was in the larder. Caleb watched her handle each crisis with calm competence and fell a little more in love with her every day. When the storm finally broke and they could dig themselves out, the damage was significant. Several sections of fence had been destroyed by the weight of snow and wind. 2 of the cattle shelters had partially collapsed. And worst of all, they discovered a dozen head of cattle had frozen to death in a distant pasture, unable to find adequate shelter. The financial loss was substantial, eating into reserves that were already stretched thin. Caleb spent a grim evening recalculating the accounts, trying to figure out how they'd make it through to spring without selling off breeding stock they'd need for next year. Maribel found him in the barn well after dark, staring at nothing. How bad? She asked quietly. Bad enough. We'll survive, but it'll be tight. She sat beside him on the hay bale, her shoulder touching his. We could sell my jewelry. It's not much, but no, that's yours. It's ours if we're partners. And it's just things, Caleb. Things don't matter compared to keeping this ranch viable. He turned to look at her, seeing the determination in her face. You'd do that? Give up the last pieces of your past? My past is jewelry in a box. My future is here, with you and Jonah. I know which one matters more. The simple statement of commitment undid something in Caleb's chest. He pulled her close, holding her tight against him. We'll find another way. But thank you for offering. They did find another way, though it required swallowing Caleb's pride. He rode to town during a brief warming spell and negotiated a loan against next season's calf crop. It wasn't ideal, the terms were tougher than he'd have liked, but it gave them the operating capital they'd need to make it through. When he returned home, Maribel had dinner waiting and Jonah had drawn him a welcome home picture. The house was warm and filled with good smells, and Caleb realized with startling clarity that this warmth, this welcome, this sense of belonging was worth more than pride or independence had ever been. March arrived with the first hints of thaw. Icicles dripped from the eaves, creating musical patterns in the melting snow. The days grew incrementally longer, and everyone's spirits lifted with the promise of spring's eventual arrival. Jonah's 4th birthday came on March 15th, and they celebrated with a cake Maribel spent an entire day perfecting. Dutch carved the boy a miniature saddle for the rocking horse Frank had built. Young Tommy contributed a book of adventure stories, and Caleb presented Jonah with something he'd been working on in secret for weeks, a wooden chest painted with scenes from the ranch, complete with the boy's name carved into the lid. It's for keeping your treasures, Caleb explained as Jonah ran his fingers over the carved letters. Things that matter to you. Like my drawings? And the horse you gave me? Like those. And whatever else becomes important as you grow. Jonah threw his arms around Caleb's waist. This is the best birthday ever because I have a papa now. The words hit Caleb with their usual force, that combination of joy and responsibility and love that still felt new enough to be overwhelming. He hugged his son close, meeting Maribel's eyes over the boy's head. She was smiling, tears tracking down her cheeks, and he knew she was feeling the same thing he was, gratitude for this unexpected family they'd built. That night, after Jonah was asleep and the house was quiet, Caleb and Maribel stood on the porch watching the stars. The air was cold but no longer brutal, carrying hints of the spring that would eventually come. "He asked me something yesterday," Maribel said quietly. "Jonah, I mean." "What did he ask?" "He asked if you were going to be his papa forever, or just until spring." Her voice caught slightly. "He's been listening to us talk about spring, about decisions and changes. He's worried." Caleb felt anger and guilt war inside him. Anger at himself for not being more careful about what they said in front of Jonah. Guilt for causing the boy anxiety. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that you loved him, and that love doesn't have an expiration date. But Caleb, we can't keep leaving things uncertain. He needs to know his world is secure." "You're right." Caleb took a breath, making a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing what waited below. "Let's get married. Not in spring. Now. As soon as we can arrange it." Maribel turned to face him, surprise evident in her expression. "You said spring. You promised to wait. I said I'd ask you again in spring if I still wanted to marry you. I still want to. I'll want to tomorrow and next month and 10 years from now. So why wait? Why put Jonah through months of uncertainty when we both know how this ends? Because what if we're wrong? What if we rush into this and realize we've made a mistake? We're not wrong. I know it the same way I know how to read weather or judge cattle. It's instinct backed by experience. We work well together, Maribel. We're good partners, good parents to Jonah. That's more than most marriages start with. But what about love? Real romantic love, not just partnership and compatibility. Caleb cupped her face in his hands, looking directly into her eyes. I love you. I've been trying to find the right moment to say it, waiting for some perfect time that probably doesn't exist. But I'm saying it now. I love you, Maribel Clark. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you hum when you're happy. I love how you protect Jonah while still teaching him to be brave. I love coming home to you at the end of every day. And if you need me to prove it through some grand gesture, I will, but I'd rather prove it by marrying you and spending the rest of my life showing you every single day. Maribel's tears were falling freely now, catching starlight as they tracked down her cheeks. That's quite a declaration. It's the truth. So marry me. Not in spring, not when it's convenient, but now. As soon as we can manage it. The roads are still difficult, getting a preacher out here. Then we go to town. We make the trip when the weather allows, and we do this properly. Jonah can be there. The hands can witness it, and we'll come back here as a real family, legal and official. Maribel was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she smiled. All right. Yes, let's do it. The simple acceptance hit Caleb with almost physical force. You're sure? I'm terrified and uncertain and worried about 100 different things. But I'm also sure that I love you too, and that Jonah deserves parents who are committed to each other and to him. So yes, Caleb Rowan, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, sealing the promise they'd just made to each other. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Maribel was laughing. What's funny? Caleb asked. Just thinking about how we got here. You hired a cook and got a family. I came looking for employment and found a home. It's absurd and perfect in equal measure. Best hiring decision I ever made. I'll remind you of that when I'm being difficult. I'm counting on it. They made the journey to town 3 weeks later during a spell of unexpectedly mild weather. Caleb drove the wagon with Maribel beside him, and Jonah bundled between them, chattering excitedly about the adventure. Dutch and Frank rode alongside as witnesses, both men trying to hide their satisfaction at seeing their boss finally settling down. The town preacher married them in a simple ceremony at the church, with Jonah standing proud as a witness, and the two ranch hands looking on with approval. Maribel wore a dress she'd altered from one of her better pieces, simple but elegant. Caleb had purchased a new shirt for the occasion, feeling awkward and formal, but determined to do this properly. When the preacher asked if he took Maribel as his lawfully wedded wife, Caleb's "I do" was firm and clear. When Maribel spoke her vows, her voice trembled slightly but never wavered, and when they were pronounced husband and wife, Jonah cheered so loudly it echoed through the small church. They spent one night at the town's only hotel, a luxury Caleb insisted on despite the cost, giving Maribel and Jonah their first experience of sleeping somewhere other than the ranch in months. The hotel room was simple but clean, and Jonah was fascinated by everything from the wallpaper to the indoor wash basin. That night, after Jonah was asleep in the small adjoining room, Caleb and Maribel finally had true privacy for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch. The intimacy was tentative at first, both of them conscious of how much had changed and how much was at stake. But as the night wore on, tentative gave way to assured, and by morning, they'd sealed their marriage in the most fundamental way. The return journey felt different, charged with the knowledge that everything had changed. They weren't employer and employee anymore, or even just partners raising a child together. They were husband and wife, committed to each other legally and emotionally. Spring arrived in earnest over the following weeks, the snow melting in earnest and revealing the land beneath. The ranch came back to life with the season, new calves being born, grass beginning to green, the whole world feeling renewed and full of possibility. Caleb taught Jonah to help with the baby calves, showing him how to check them, how to tell if they were healthy, how to move slowly and calmly around the mothers. The boy took to ranch work with enthusiasm, eager to learn everything he could. Watching him, Caleb could see the man Jonah would become, capable, confident, rooted in this land. Maribel transformed the house in subtle ways, adding touches that made it feel more like a home and less like a bachelor's dwelling. Curtains appeared in the windows. Wildflowers filled jars on the table. The kitchen became a place of warmth and wonderful smells, and the evenings were filled with conversation and laughter instead of solitary silence. The financial situation improved as spring progressed. The surviving cattle were healthy, the calving season was successful, and early grass growth promised good grazing. Caleb began to feel confident they'd not only survive, but potentially thrive. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold, Maribel made an announcement that would change everything again. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Caleb turned to her, surprise and joy warring on his face. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be at this stage. All the signs are there. I'd say I'm about 2 months along, which means a baby sometime in November." A baby. Another child. Caleb tried to process the information, to understand what it meant for their growing family. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified? Excited? Worried about a dozen different things." She took his hand, "but mostly happy. Jonah needs a sibling, and I think we're ready for this." "We are," Caleb agreed, the certainty settling over him like a warm blanket. "We're ready." They told Jonah a few days later, sitting him down for a serious conversation about becoming a big brother. The boy's reaction was pure delight, already planning all the things he'd teach the baby, all the ways he'd help. "Will the baby be a boy or a girl?" Jonah asked. "We won't know until it arrives," Maribel explained. "But either way, you'll be an excellent big brother." "I'll protect them," Jonah said solemnly, "just like Papa protects us." The summer passed in a blur of work and preparation. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Maribel's careful accounting and Caleb's hands-on knowledge combining to create something more effective than either could have achieved alone. They hired another hand to help with the increased workload, a young man named Samuel who proved to be hardworking and reliable. Maribel's pregnancy progressed normally, though she refused to slow down until Caleb and Dutch practically forced her to rest. She continued cooking and managing the household, though she delegated the heavier tasks and allowed herself afternoon naps that she'd never have taken before. Jonah flourished through the summer, growing taller and more confident, becoming a true ranch child. He could ride Bess unassisted now, could help with basic chores, could recognize sick cattle, and know when to fetch an adult. Caleb watched him with pride and something approaching awe. This child they were raising together was becoming exactly the kind of person he'd hoped for. In October, as Maribel's time drew near, Caleb began to panic about the logistics of birth on a remote ranch. They made arrangements for the town doctor to come stay when the time arrived, prepared the bedroom with everything Maribel said they'd need, and generally tried to prepare for something that couldn't truly be anticipated. The baby came in early November, on a cold but clear morning. Labor started just after dawn, and by mid-afternoon Maribel had delivered a healthy baby girl. Caleb, who'd been banished to anxious pacing with Jonah and the hands, was finally allowed in to meet his daughter. She was tiny and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same storm gray as his and Jonah's. Maribel, exhausted but radiant, cradled the baby against her chest. "She needs a name," she said. They discussed options but never settled on one, both of them wanting to meet the baby first. Now, looking at this small person who'd just entered the world, Caleb knew. "Sarah," he said, "after my mother. If that's all right with you." Maribel smiled. "Sarah Rowan, it's perfect." Jonah was allowed in to meet his sister, his eyes wide with wonder at the tiny creature in his mother's arms. "She's so small," he whispered. "You were this small once," Maribel told him, "and you'll help her grow, just like Papa helped you." "I promise," Jonah said solemnly, reaching out one careful finger to touch his sister's tiny hand. Sarah's fingers curled around his, and the boy's face lit up with joy. "She likes me." "Of course she does," Caleb said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You're her big brother." The winter that followed was different from the previous one. Instead of isolation and uncertainty, there was family and purpose. Instead of wondering if they'd make it through, there was planning for the future. The house was full of life, a baby's cries, a 4-year-old's laughter, the comfortable rhythm of a marriage finding its footing. Caleb found himself experiencing moments of profound gratitude, usually at unexpected times. Watching Maribel nurse Sarah while Jonah drew at the table, coming in from work to find his whole family waiting for him, waking in the middle of the night to comfort a crying baby, and finding Maribel already there, working together in sleepy partnership. This was what he'd been missing all those years alone. This warmth, this connection, this sense of building something that would last beyond his own life. The ranch was no longer just his legacy. It was something he was creating for his children, a foundation they could build upon. One evening in December, a year after that fateful Christmas when he and Maribel had first acknowledged their feelings, Caleb stood on the porch looking at his land. Snow covered everything, but it was beautiful rather than threatening. Smoke curled from the chimney, and through the window he could see his family, Maribel rocking Sarah, Jonah showing her one of his drawings. Dutch joined him, the foreman's breath steaming in the cold air. "Quite a year, boss." "That it has been." "You thinking about what might have happened if that woman hadn't answered your advertisement?" Caleb had thought about it, often. "I'd still be alone, still running this place with no one to share it with. You'd have survived." "Surviving isn't the same as living." Caleb turned to his old friend. "You taught me that, whether you knew it or not. Watching you these past years, always talking about your grandchildren, always looking forward to visits, I thought you were soft. Now I understand you were just human." Dutch chuckled. "Took you long enough. Better late than never." "That's the truth." The foreman clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "You did good, boss. Built yourself a real family. That boy in there, he's going to be something special. And that baby girl, she'll probably run this whole operation someday if you're not careful." "I hope she does. I hope they both do. Together." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Dutch headed off to the bunkhouse. Caleb remained on the porch a while longer, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he'd been a solitary man convinced he needed no one. Now he was a husband and father, his life enriched beyond measure by the woman and children who'd transformed his house into a home. It hadn't been easy. There had been struggles and doubts and moments when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. But standing here now, looking at his family through the window, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment had been worth it. Every compromise, every sacrifice, every time he'd chosen connection over isolation had brought him closer to this, to a life that mattered not just because of what he'd built, but because of who he'd built it for. Inside, Jonah looked up and saw him through the window. The boy's face broke into a wide smile, and he waved enthusiastically. Caleb waved back, feeling his chest expand with love for this child who'd come into his life unexpected and perfect. Maribel appeared beside Jonah, Sarah in her arms. She mouthed something through the glass, probably telling him to come inside before he froze. And Caleb nodded. But he took one more moment, committing this scene to memory. His wife, his children, his home, his family. When he finally went inside, the warmth enveloped him like an embrace. Jonah immediately launched into an excited story about something that had happened earlier, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to share. Maribel smiled at Caleb over their son's head, an expression of shared amusement and contentment. Later, after Jonah was in bed and Sarah was sleeping, Caleb and Maribel sat together by the fire. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they simply existed in the quiet peace of evening. "No regrets?" Maribel asked softly. "None. You?" "Not a single one." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to let us stay. For choosing us when you could have sent us away. For becoming the man Jonah needed and the husband I didn't know I was looking for." "I didn't choose you," Caleb said, kissing the top of her head. "You chose me by answering that advertisement. I just had the sense to recognize what you were offering." "What was I offering?" "A second chance, a family, a life worth living instead of just surviving." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low, neither of them eager to end the day. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the ranch in white. Inside, warmth and love and the future they were building together. Caleb Rowan had spent most of his life alone, convinced that solitude was strength and independence was safety. He'd built a successful ranch through sheer determination and stubbornness, proving to himself and the world that he needed no one. But he'd been wrong, so beautifully, perfectly wrong, because the real strength wasn't in standing alone. It was in choosing to stand together. The real safety wasn't in walls of isolation. It was in the bonds of family and love. And the real success wasn't measured in acres or cattle or money, but in the laughter of children and the touch of a beloved wife, and the knowledge that when he died, he'd leave behind more than just land. He'd leave behind a family, a legacy, a love that would endure. And that, Caleb realized as he held his wife close and listened to his children sleep, was everything he'd never known he needed and more than he'd ever dared to dream possible. The snow continued to fall through the night, peaceful and pure, covering the ranch in silence. But inside the house, life hummed with warmth and promise, a family safe and whole, building a future one day at a time, proving that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never planned for, but choose to embrace with your whole heart.